an emotional flag ceremony at Ground Zero today, 17 years after those terror attacks. Now, I want to bring in Dominic and Andrew to talk about that day and 17 years later. And again, we will get to your phone calls this segment. And Dom, I'll start with you. Obviously, for folks who know, you covered New York politics and have been for a long, long time. And you were in New York that day. Talk about what stuck out to you. And I'll ask the same question to Andrew, and then we'll bring it around to where we are today.
That I had never seen a New York like this my entire life. We were preparing for primary night. Mm-hmm. It was the first of many first-time things I've seen on 9/11. And so on primary night, I come in late, 3 o'clock, because I'm going to be on the air until 11, 12 o'clock. So you come in late. All of a sudden, the phone rings. And primary day, the election, Fernando Ferrer, Mark Green, was canceled. So I had never seen an election outright canceled. The Board of Elections just said, we're not doing it, and they rescheduled it. So then I was ordered to come into work because all hands on deck for 9/11, and I had never seen the Tappan Zee Bridge closed, ever. And I've got to I didn't have the car then. I had to get from Rockland to New York City. And so they announced that any minute the Tappan Zee Bridge was closing. I got to the bridge, and then a man, some type of gardening man, gave me a ride to Manhattan. I had never seen the New York City subway system shut down in my entire life. I got there, Richard, it was shut down. So how am I going to get from the tip of the Bronx all the way downtown?
And everybody talked about that. But, Andrew, that ghostly scene that was there and the unknown, and you saw it from the other side. You saw it from the Jersey side.
I saw it from the Jersey side that day. We went up to Hoboken and we watched as close as we could. I mean, the towers were, I grew up in Central Jersey. I was still living in Central Jersey at the time, and the towers were always the first sign of New York as you were approaching. I remember that morning after the towers were struck, I got a call from my sister who lived right next to the Pentagon in Washington, and she was scared. And I was telling her, there's nothing to worry about, this is a New York thing. And I was on the phone with her when the plane hit the Pentagon, and she could feel it. And so the fact that it hit so close to so many people and to home. I also remember, because I was working for Channel 9 at the time, 5 days after 9/11, I finally got in to the city. And there were two things I remember. One is we went to the Armory on the Upper East Side, which had all of the missing posters, the 8.5 by 11 pages that were posted on the side of the Armory taller than I was, and circumnavigated the block and went on to the buildings. You just got a sense of the totality of how many people were going to be missing from the whole thing. The other thing is, I had a friend who lived in Tribeca. You remember they'd closed off Canal Street and everything south in the weeks after. So we were able to get into the restricted access. And I remember you looked south from the intersection that I was standing in, and you could see the pyre of the World Trade Center, this is 5 days later, still smoking and still smoke rising. You looked to the east, and it was like an abandoned town because nobody was there. There was dust on every windowsill and pieces of paper, and people's lives were rolling down the street. You looked to the north, and you saw the armed National Guardsmen with their rifles, and you wondered, well, is this the direction we're going in? Is this going to be the new normal? And then to the west, I remember seeing a glimpse of the Statue of Liberty and the blue skies above New Jersey, and remember the weather that week. It was beautiful weather-wise that week. And so you saw a glimpse of normalcy as a potential. And so I felt like I was at a crossroads. Which direction is New York going to wind up going? Which direction are we going to wind up going? 17 years later, I'm not exactly sure the answer to that question.
No, and I'm going to get calls. And for me, it's two things. I remembered, because I had, our station at the time was up in the Upper Hudson Valley, up in Kingston, and I would literally have a 100-mile ride every time. What people may not realize is so many of the firefighters and the cops, they called the suburban areas, you know, from Rockland and Orange County or whatever, they called them home. It's famous, it's Middletown Fire Department who, you know, yeah. So I would be going to the firehouses after, and you've never seen bigger guys that just were like walking ghosts. And the sacrifice that the fire departments made, not just the FDNY, but all the communities was just, so that was one. But there was also two other stories that, the stories we never told. I had a congresswoman, whose name I won't say, who said to me, there's 50,000 people dead in the towers. I wouldn't go with it on the air because it just did. And I won't even say, somebody had gotten the phone conversation from one of the people from Flight 93 who, because it had to go through whatever connections to, he had the final phone conversation from one of the people right before they said, let's roll, to his loved ones saying the goodbyes. And he said, do you want this? And I said, no, I feel like I'm invading, like most of us wouldn't do. You would think that's this private moment. But when you hear those chilling final words, and there were so many of these moments, and I opened up the phone lines for literally 2 weeks right after it, and just to hear the raw loss and the raw fear from people where we went from here, the anger that was palpable out there, and people forget what some of the people wanted to see in this country, it stuck with me. And then we find ourselves 17 years later in a much different place. People in our business debate whether we should still air the 9/11 memorials in their entirety, and some don't. I think, we anesthetize things by pretending not pretend they don't happen, but just ignoring it. I don't think that's a national service. But a lot of people, don't know where we are right now. And I have to say, I understand that sentiment. I didn't think we'd be where we are 17 years later with some of the conversations we have. But I want to bring in the callers, and thank you for holding. We have Kevin first. He's calling us from Westchester. Kevin, thank you for holding on the line. Go right ahead.
Yes. At the time, I was living and working in Manhattan, in Harlem, and I was a teacher, and I had a first period prep class. And so I wasn't in the room with my students, and one of the custodians told me that that a plane had hit one of the towers. And I couldn't understand how could a plane hit that great big building. I was like, they couldn't see it. So he took me to his office, and I could see on the television that smoke was billowing. And then I had to go to another office in the school, and by the time I got there, I found out that a second plane had hit the second tower, at which point I realized that this was no mistake. And then I was wondering, how was I going to deal with this with my sixth grade students? So I went back to the room, and I asked if any of the students had parents who worked at the World Trade Center, and prayerfully, no one said yes. And eventually we found out that they had stopped all the trains at 125th Street, and there were people all over the place, and parents were running to the school to get their children. And it was so ironic because that was such a beautiful day. Bright blue sky, and it was just amazing. And I couldn't reach my children. I had two children downtown in high school, one on the east side, one on the west side, a daughter working at a school in Brooklyn. My wife worked at Jersey Medical Center in Jersey City, right across from the towers. And the only reason that she was able to get home that night was because she's also in the military. She had to go all the way up to New Jersey, across the Tappan Zee Bridge, down through 87, Major Deegan, and they only allowed her into Manhattan.
Touching on things that we even forget, just people that were abandoned in New York, and the strangers of people walking up the West Side Highway, right? And how do you get there? But there was the other thing, Dom, and all the misinformation that was going on. People didn't know it was just restricted to New York and the Pentagon, and then later to that Pennsylvania countryside. There was reports of other imminent attacks, etc. And we had a conversation with one of our friends here who was pressured not to open schools the next day. And all these decisions about when could the next happen, can we even protect areas like schools, that was just a reality. And let me go to Jordan. He's calling us in Peekskill. Jordan, you're on the line. Go, Jordan.
I just got cut off.
Okay, I'm gonna get back to the phone calls in a second. I lost Jordan, but as I was saying, Don, people forget just how, Andrew mentioned you had guys, with assault weapons basically on street corners, and nobody knew where we were going to be going the next day or the next hour.
Richard, it was almost like a scene from the Twilight Zone in terms of, they had shut down the New York City subway system. I happened to catch one of the last trains from the tip of the Bronx down to 42nd Street. I had never seen Times Square like that before in my life. It was almost like people were walking around, to your point, no one knew what was coming next. And I had never seen Times Square or the subway system empty. I had never encountered anything like that before in my life.
I still, like, in the days after, how polite everybody was, how everybody was united in the days following. Cab drivers would stop and let people cross the street. I mean, I saw a bus with officers by the armory getting out and shift change, and they got a standing ovation from the people who were there. It's especially in the times that we're in now. Especially in the times that we're in now, it's helpful to think back on how united we were in those days and maybe ask ourselves how we got away from that.
To your point, everybody wanted to be better.
Yeah.
I mean, something as simple as baseball. They wanted to honor the cops and the firefighters. Everybody wanted to do. You didn't care that Bush was a Republican or a Democrat. You wanted him, when he threw that first pitch, nobody's had more people cheering to throw it over the plate, and he did.
I was rooting for the Yankees.
Hey, that shows you how much we go. All right, let's go to Jordan in Peekskill. We've reestablished the call. Go ahead, Jordan, you're on.
Hi, Richard. Hi, everybody. I'm a school teacher also in Forest Hills High School, and I remember driving to school and, hearing that the first plane had hit and thinking that it was, strange, as Dominic said. And then when I heard the second plane had hit a building, then I knew something was really wrong. When I got to school, it was election day, and an older couple was coming out of my school, and I said to them, America is under attack. I just had that sense about it. Later in the day, maybe by my third period, when I had heard that the towers had come down, I actually just started crying in front of my class. It had been the first time ever. It was just so overwhelming, with the knowledge of the loss of life. And, it was very difficult emotionally. I remember throwing myself on the couch later in the day, just completely overwhelmed by it. And I remember also in my school, there's one on the fourth floor. There's one exit where you can see, one stairwell you could see the towers. And I ran over because I couldn't believe that they had come down. And I ran over there and I looked over and they were gone. And it was surreal. And I'm still shaken by it every September 11th. I can't even watch it.
Jordan, thank you. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue with more of your calls, and we'll also talk about then and now and where we are as a country as well. You see the toll-free number. If you're not on the lines, please join us, 387-662-2428. We remember 9/11. RFL back after this.